The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. These words, written in the private journals of Marcus Aurelius, form one of the final pillars of the Stoic Blueprint, a radical reframe of how we interpret difficulty. Most people experience obstacles as interruptions, signals that progress has been denied or that fate has turned against them. An obstacle appears as friction, delay, rejection, limitation. It feels like a stop sign. But Stoic philosophy proposes something far less intuitive. The obstacle is not the interruption of the path, it is the path. Resistance is not evidence that you are moving in the wrong direction. It is evidence that you are moving at all. Growth does not occur in the absence of difficulty. It requires it. The metaphor Marcus returns to is transformation to resistance. A weak flame is smothered by a heavy log, but a strong fire consumes it, growing hotter and brighter precisely because of the additional material. Difficulty is combustible. The question is not whether obstacles exist, they are guaranteed, but what kind of fire we bring to them. When we lack internal structure, resistance feels destructive. When we develop internal structure, resistance becomes fuel. The same event can extinguish or strengthen depending on interpretation and response. This is where the Stoic shift begins. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" the question becomes, "What can this become for me?" That single change moves a person from passive reaction into active engagement. Losing a job stops being only loss. It becomes confrontation with uncertainty, identity, adaptability, and courage. The end of a relationship stops being only heartbreak. It becomes an encounter with attachment, boundaries, self-knowledge, and emotional resilience. Physical limitation stops being only restriction. It becomes a laboratory for patience, creativity, and perspective. The obstacle contains a curriculum. Without the obstacle, the lesson remains theoretical. Every difficulty activates a specific virtue. Rudeness invites patience. Delay invites discipline. Failure invites humility. Uncertainty invites courage. Scarcity invites resourcefulness. These virtues cannot be developed in abstraction. You cannot practice patience without something testing your patience. You cannot practice courage without risk. You cannot practice resilience without disruption. In that sense, adversity is not separate from character development. It is the mechanism through which character becomes visible. Virtue is potential until pressure reveals it. Seen this way, events we label as bad shift from meaningless misfortune to structured opportunity. This does not romanticize suffering or deny pain. Stoicism does not claim difficulty feels good. It claims difficulty can be used. The distinction is crucial. A Stoic does not celebrate loss. They refuse to waste it. If something difficult is already happening, it can either produce resentment or development. The obstacle guarantees one of those outcomes. Interpretation determines which. This mindset fundamentally changes the emotional relationship with the future. Fear often arises from the belief that certain events would be purely destructive. But once you internalize that any event can become material for growth, uncertainty becomes less threatening. You do not need the future to be easy in order to face it. You only need the confidence that you can work with what appears. This is the Stoic version of psychological alchemy, not changing events into pleasant ones, but changing experience into meaning, turning the lead of circumstance into the gold of character. Importantly, this philosophy does not encourage the pursuit of suffering. Stoicism is not about seeking hardship for its own sake. It is about refusing avoidance when hardship arrives naturally. The path of least resistance often feels comfortable in the short term, but it also limits expansion. Muscles strengthen through resistance. Skills develop through mistakes. Identity clarifies through challenge. A life engineered to avoid friction eventually avoids growth. The Stoic alternative is engagement. Meet difficulty directly. Extract what it offers. Move forward altered rather than diminished. There is also a practical dimension to this principle. Obstacles force creativity. Constraints produce innovation because they remove default options. When something blocks the obvious route, the mind searches for alternative routes. Many breakthroughs, personal and collective, emerge from limitation rather than abundance. Scarcity sharpens attention. Failure redirects effort. Rejection refines direction. The obstacle is not only emotional training, it is strategic information. It tells you where adjustment is required. At a deeper level, this approach reframes identity itself. If you define yourself by outcomes, obstacles threaten identity. If you define yourself by response, obstacles express identity. The event becomes secondary. The reaction becomes primary. This shift creates stability because events fluctuate while the capacity to respond can be cultivated. The Stoic Blueprint, therefore, relocates self-worth from what happens to how you meet what happens. You stop measuring life by smoothness and start measuring it by engagement. This is why Stoics often describe problems not as accidents but as assignments. Not assignments given by a conscious universe in a literal sense, but assignments embedded in reality's structure. Each moment presents conditions, and those conditions implicitly ask something of you. Patience, clarity, restraint, courage, honesty, persistence. The question, why me? Looks backward toward cause. The question, what does this require of me? Looks forward toward action. The second question restores agency immediately. Adopting this blueprint gradually produces psychological resilience that appears almost unshakable from the outside. This resilience is not toughness in the sense of emotional suppression. It is flexibility in interpretation. When the unexpected happens, the mind does not collapse into the assumption that progress is over. Instead, it begins scanning for leverage. Where is the opportunity inside the difficulty? What skill is being demanded? What adaptation is possible now that was not visible before? Obstacles stop being walls and start becoming directional signals. There is a quiet confidence that emerges from this orientation. You realize that progress is rarely linear and that friction is not evidence of failure. Many of the experiences that later define strength initially feel like detours. The thing that slowed you down becomes the thing that changed your trajectory. The rejection that closed one path created exposure to another. The limitation that forced adjustment produced capability that ease never would have required. The obstacle becomes retrospectively necessary. This perspective also dissolves the illusion that life is supposed to be smooth. Expecting smoothness guarantees frustration because reality includes unpredictability, complexity, and resistance. Accepting resistance normalizes it. When resistance is normal, encountering it does not feel like personal injustice. It feels like part of the terrain. And when something is part of the terrain, the mind shifts from complaint to navigation. You stop arguing with the existence of the obstacle and start working with its shape. A sailing metaphor captures this well. Wind can slow you if you fight it directly, but it can move you if you adjust the sail. The wind does not change. Orientation does. Stoicism is the discipline of adjusting orientation repeatedly. The storm remains a storm, but you learn to extract movement from it. Survival becomes progress. Difficulty becomes direction. What once looked like opposition reveals itself as propulsion when approached skillfully. Over time, this changes how you interpret your past as well. Experiences that once appeared purely negative begin to reveal secondary value. Skills developed, clarity gained, resilience built, priorities reordered. The narrative shifts from "this should not have happened" to "this changed me in ways I could not have engineered." That narrative does not erase pain, but it integrates it. Integration is what converts experience into wisdom. Without integration, difficulty remains interruption. With integration, it becomes structure. Ultimately, the Stoic insight is not that obstacles are secretly pleasant, but that they are inherently usable. Reality provides raw material continuously, some desirable, some not. The art is learning to work with all of it. When you adopt this approach, You no longer wait for ideal conditions to move forward. Movement happens with the conditions that exist. Progress becomes less fragile because it no longer depends on ease. You begin to recognize a pattern. The thing that looked like it would stop you often becomes the thing that defines you. The limitation reveals creativity. The setback reveals persistence. The failure reveals direction. The obstacle reveals capability. What once appeared as a barrier becomes the mechanism of advancement. The path was never blocked. It was being shaped. The cave of obstacles only feels dark when you stand outside it, imagining what lies within. Once you step inside, your eyes adjust. You begin to see structure where you expected chaos, possibility where you expected closure. And eventually, you discover the central Stoic promise embedded in Marcus Aurelius' words, that progress does not require the removal of resistance. It requires the willingness to use resistance. What stands in the way becomes the way, not metaphorically, but practically, because the very forces that challenge you are the forces that build you when you choose to engage them.